So good afternoon. Thank you for being with us both here in person, but also virtually. I'm Ben Averill, and I'm here with my colleague Hillary Gove. And we are the two co-coordinators of the Housing Opportunity Program within the Department of Economic and Community Development. I know that's a mouthful for me to say and for you to hear of our titles, but we are the two folks that are in charge of both doing technical assistance and rollout of LD2003 related components, as well as facilitating funding through the Housing Opportunity Program, which is our office. We have a presentation to go through with you this afternoon. Those of you in the room all have the PowerPoint with you in case you want to take notes or want to skip ahead or go back to things. For those on Zoom, we're going to be going through this PowerPoint. If it's okay with you, Jen, we'll probably pause at each particular statute and have a little bit of time for questions. That way we can get a couple of questions in, and then if there's time, go back to it if that works for you.
That's absolutely fine. And I'll email out the presentation to everyone who participates as well.
Perfect. For anybody who is unaware, LD2003 is a law that was signed into being in April of 2022. The intent of the law was to help facilitate increased housing opportunities in Maine by requiring communities to amend or create new zoning ordinances. LD2003 was the culmination of a series of convening of working groups in 2021, which established 10 or 11 items that the state could do to help facilitate new housing opportunities, and LD2003 captured about half of those recommendations from the commission that had met the year prior. Generally speaking, LD2003 has a couple of different statutes, but there are three main statutes for your local purposes to be aware of, and we'll generally touch on those three statutes during this afternoon session. So LD2003 has a provision to allow for additional density for affordable housing developments, a provision to allow for the addition of 2 to 4 dwelling units per lot where there's a residential use permitted, and a provision for accessory dwelling units to be allowed on a lot where a single family home exists. The LD2003 also had a couple of components to establish housing production goals as a state, as well as to help align local and regional plans with the Federal Fair Housing Act and the Maine Human Rights Act. And it also created the program that Hillary and I run, and helped give us funding for a couple of things that we'll talk about in this presentation as well. So that was a long way to say there is a lot of components of a lot of kind of multifaceted components of housing policy in the state. Earlier this year, or earlier in 2023, I guess it's not this year anymore. In 2023, there was a Maine housing production needs study that was done, that was facilitated as part of LD2003, which looked at the housing needs throughout the state, both of housing units that were unable to be created and that needed to be created to accommodate current need, but also projecting future need. And you can see on the screen, and for those that are here, you can see on the PowerPoint you have in front of you what those numbers are. But generally speaking, as of 2023, the state had not produced, we were underproduced by 38,000 units. And for future expected need, by 2030, we're expected that we would want somewhere between 76 and 84,000 units to be created in the state of Maine. And so that study really was kind of it occurred after LD2003 was passed, but it was really the impetus for understanding what challenges we faced prior to LD 2003 and what our need is going forward for the next 8 or 10 years. LD 2003, and we'll talk about this for much of our presentation, but LD 2003 helps to remove some local regulatory barriers to creating additional housing, while allowing you still to have different components of home rule of law. So you can still locally create land use plans that protect sensitive environmental resources, including utilizing shoreline zoning. You can still regulate a housing development based on the documented water and wastewater capacity, meaning you need to still be doing the ability to serve and making sure that there's adequate water and wastewater. You can still enforce shoreline zoning, and you can still create a rate of growth ordinance if you choose to. So that was a lot. This next slide is a good kind of synopsis of what the 3 main statutes of LD 2003 are. So as I mentioned, there are 3 different statutes, or we call them buckets, that really are focused on the meat and potatoes of how LD 2003 is enacted locally. For today's session, we're going to, I'll talk about them in a second, but for today's session, we're going to really focus on the middle bucket and the far right bucket. And we'll skip over the affordable housing component and then come back to that if there's time, because there are many communities here in Washington County that do not utilize zoning. So we want to make sure we have enough time to talk to you about things that impact the whole county, and then we can go back to the affordable housing provision. I know for you all in this room, it's probably easier to look at what you have on your person instead of on the screen. But for those on Zoom, if you look at what you have on the screen, each of those 3 buckets represent a different statute that's part of LD 2003. The first statute that you'll come across is the Affordable Housing Density Bonus, and that's 30A MRS 4364. That is a density bonus that's granted for affordable housing projects that are 51% or more of affordable, of those units being affordable. When that's located in an area that has zoning and designates a multifamily use, and then has either water and sewer and a growth area. And again, if there's time, we will get more into the specifics of what that means. But if you have our whole presentation, there is all the information on the affordable housing provision in the handouts that you have either in person or that you'll have emailed to you. The middle bucket is 30A MRS 4364A, which is the up to 4 dwelling units provision. This provision requires a community to allow either up to 2 or up to 4 lots on a residential, so up to 2 or up to 4 units on a residential lot, depending on whether there is adequate public water and sewer or designated growth area. And we'll get into the specifics of that shortly. And then the third bucket is related to accessory dwelling units, and that's 30A MRS 4364B. And broadly speaking, that allows one ADU on a lot where there is a single family home. And we'll get into the specifics, what that looks like and what exactly an ADU is later in our presentation. So we're skipping through these affordable housing provisions, but we are happy to go back to it. And then those of you that have the copy in front of you or getting emailed this presentation, you certainly can look at that at a later time as well. So this is the middle bucket, the middle statute, which is 4364A. And broadly speaking, what it requires for a municipality to allow between 2 and 4 dwelling units on a lot where residential use is allowed and where there is adequate water and wastewater capacity. You can, municipalities cannot have a different land area requirement than what exists for a single unit. So what you have on the screen or in front of you, what that picture is showing is that if you utilize 1 acre of lot area requirement per dwelling unit, that needs to be consistent over those dwelling units. So for the second and third unit, you can require 1 acre or less, but you can't require more land area. And we can, if you have questions, we can get to those specifics.
Can I ask just a quick question? So the interpretation of this 1 unit versus 2 units versus 3, it's, you're just basing that on 10,000 square feet, assuming that that's what's in a current ordinance. But if your ordinance is asking for more than that, you wouldn't have to reduce it to 10,000.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay,
You do
Okay.
not have to, the only time where you would need to reduce your lot area requirement is if your ordinance previously had said it's 1 acre for 1 dwelling unit and 5 acres for 2 dwelling units. And
Okay.
LD 2003 in that example would require it to be 1 acre for 1 dwelling unit and 2 acres for 2 dwelling units.
okay.
But per ordinance, municipalities, per LD 2003, municipalities do not need to change their minimum lot size requirements in ordinance to comply with the new law. So if you have 1 acre currently as the minimum lot size requirement, that can stay.
Okay,
Correct.
And if you
okay,
have
that's
none.
helpful.
And if you have none, then you don't need to add them.
That's none.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to do something. Next slide. This next slide really gets into the soup and nuts of what exactly we mean when we say up to 4 units. So if you are a municipality that does not have water and sewer, or does not have a comprehensive plan that designates a growth area, then you need to make sure that any lot in your community can have at least 2 units on that lot. If you're a community that does have access to public water and sewer on the same lot, or has a comp plan with a designated growth area, you would need to make sure that lots that are in those particular circumstances could have up to 4 units on those, on that particular lot. And I'll get to your question in 2 seconds.
Okay.
And generally speaking, what this law does, for lack of a better terminology, is it eliminates single family zoning. So whether you utilize zoning or not, it is requiring any lot throughout the state to have the ability to build greater than a single family home. So if you are a community that uses zoning, you would want to make sure that your use tables, if you have one, allow every lot in town to have more than a single family home on them. If you do not use zoning, then if there's something in your building permit ordinance, you just want to make sure that a lot owner could add multiple units onto their lot as well. And all of these provisions, and I think it goes into this in our next slide, but all of these provisions are still subject to dimensional requirements and how you build on a lot. So setback requirements, land area requirements, all of those things are still subject to someone adding that additional lot. I'll get to you after him.
Okay, like I think it's 33,000 square feet do we have for
30.
30,000?
Okay, yeah.
But there's also the requirement, I believe, with state law that you can't have wells and septic systems closer than 100 feet to each other. Now, if you put 2 or 3 houses on a small lot and they're all separate houses, we don't have water and sewer in Jonesville. So we have to abide by that other requirements. There's physically no room to do that.
Sure. So
So what do you do?
you're still subject to minimum lot size requirements for subsurface wastewater disposal. So
Right.
you're still subject to that. So that could be a barrier to development.
So that's what I was trying to clarify is when you take a look at their,
There are 1, 2, 3 here.
Yeah.
If you substitute 30,000 square feet. So 1 house on 30,000 square feet, 2 houses on 60,000 square feet, and 3 houses on 90,000 square
Well, yeah,
feet.
that
That would
makes sense,
apply
but-
with what we're talking
What
about.
I'm gathering that they're saying is that this law is now saying you can put 2, 3, or 4 houses.
What he's saying is if your ordinance restricts on a lot, it could be 100,000 square feet. If your ordinance or your zoning rules restrict dwelling per lot, that's not allowed. You have to allow multiple dwellings on a lot, assuming all the other.
That's what I'm just saying, but how are you gonna physically put?
If it's 100,000 square foot lot, it's easy. All the other rules still apply.
Most of the lots in the village of Jonesport are non-conforming already. They don't.
So this will not,
Wouldn't be.
this won't have any impact on you.
Correct. So
But the question I brought up was about keeping water systems and septic systems
mhm.
at a certain distance from each other.
So
100 feet, so you take a circle that's 100 feet in radius. On the well here, where are you gonna put the septic system?
So any of the new units created through LD 2003, regardless of which bucket it's coming from, the reviewing body, which is usually your code enforcement officer or the inspector, depending on which, how you do things, still needs to make sure that new has access to water and wastewater capacity.
Yeah.
As well as is something that conforms to some version of building code and life safety code, depending on whether you're a MUBEC town or not. I know you have a question. Bear with me for 2 more seconds. Okay. We switched to a new page in our PowerPoint. Hopefully, this kind of shows at least a little bit of what that could look like. So if you have a lot that does not have a residential use on it, and it's a lot that doesn't have access to public water and sewer, and is not located in a town that has a comprehensive plan where that designated growth area is, then that lot should be able to build 2 units, should have the ability to build 2 units, but the ability to build those 2 units are still subject to adequate water and wastewater, meeting the land area requirement for having 2 units, and then meeting setback requirements and any of the other parameters of building, frontage requirements, ways in which you construct a thing on a lot.
So I think that I would just stress that LD 2003 is requiring towns to update ordinances to allow the different use types, but it doesn't mean in every single situation, somebody will be able to build additional units on their lot. It's really other factors that are in local ordinance can control the development.
Let me repeat this just to see if I've got it. If, let's say hypothetically, we wanted to build some housing units in Quebec. And we need to do them in quantities as opposed to single. And we want to put it in an area beyond where the water extends, the town water. Would it be permissible for us to build all of those units, put in a source for water that's not town water, but know that we are sitting on tons of aquifers? Could we do that and provide sewer, septic? If we did all of that, would that bypass any of this kind of regulation?
That would mean.
The code.
As long as we met those, you know.
So regardless of how much density is being proposed or what is being proposed, anything that's being proposed both under LD 2003 and prior still is required to meet whatever the code officer determines is adequate water and wastewater. So if you can create enough well systems to have that for the number of units you are proposing, that would be fine. There is a provision we skipped over for affordable housing developments. And I'm not sure if that's what you're asking about.
I think that's kind of where I'm going.
Okay.
We can loop back to that because a lot of the communities that are here today don't have zoning, so they do not have to abide by that first statute. We didn't want to, spend half an hour talking about something that you don't even have to comply with, but we can loop back to it.
That will have zoning very soon.
Okay, and we're also.
Did you have a question too? Because
Yeah.
I don't lose your.
Yeah.
I'm kind of on, we're both with that, but I'm kind of the opposite end of the question. If we're in town where we have sewer and septic, we've got a single family lot. we can now, assuming the planning board doesn't come up with some objection, put a 4-unit building on it. And the town has no real, the town therefore can't object to that as long as it fits the lot based on this.
Lubec have a comprehensive plan?
No.
Yes,
Well,
it does.
yes, it does.
Does it have designated growth areas
No,
in that comprehensive?
No,
it does. The new one, which I can't get anybody talking about.
but you're not on it.
She's on the committee.
So it's specific to lots in designated growth areas that you could have up to 4 units on it.
Mhm.
But those, we're talking about lots that do not have an existing residential unit
Okay.
on them. But if you had a lot with a existing single family home, you could add up to 2 units on that lot, regardless of being in a growth area or if you didn't have public water and sewer. But in your case, it sounds like you have public water and sewer.
In town, we do.
Yeah.
Okay, now, Lubec, to add to what Martha's saying is, we are fighting, as I'm sure everybody is, newbies coming into town and putting in little, I mean, trying to get a little rental that goes along with another, main house. And we've had to put together ordinances that will limit, the distance and that kind of thing. So that's where we're going with that.
Not to jump ahead too far, but we also, as part of LD 2003, it does allow municipalities to regulate short-term rentals if there are worries in a community about a proliferation of short-term rentals based on this type of development.
And we'll touch on that later in the presentation.
So
I
I
don't
haven't
wanna-
seen any hands come up online yet, but do you want to take just a minute to see if anybody who's joining by Zoom has a question?
I was just about to say that Zoom if they have questions.
And I'd also like to say for the folks on Zoom, if you could please put your email address in the chat. I have most of you, but I don't have all of you. So in order to send you the presentation, I really need your address. Thank you.
My question is, and I don't know if anybody else is gonna, please interrupt me if anybody online wants to interrupt me.
Or if you use the raise your hand feature, we'll make sure we get to you next.
But the math that's in the affordable housing, that math isn't applicable to these other 2 ordinances. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
So,
okay. I just wanted to clarify.
all 3 statutes are standalone statutes, even though they were all looped into LD 2003, all of their provisions are provisions individualized to that particular statute.
Okay,
And they all have the intent of increasing housing opportunities and choices throughout the state, but they all feel a little bit different.
And in the beginning, when we showed those numbers of what the state was projecting they would need for additional units, we're talking about all types of units, not just affordable units as defined by the state or the Department of Urban Development. So especially when we're talking about this statute and the accessory dwelling unit statute, there isn't that affordability context that you're referring
Right,
to.
okay.
Those specific area median income levels in order to build this type of housing. We're really talking about more somebody who owns a lot can now build more units on it and they could rent it out to their family. They could rent it out for market value. They could do whatever they want with it unless there's something in ordinance that says otherwise.
can I do a what if just real quick? So say I've got somebody that has a lot that's 120,000 square feet. If it's undeveloped right now and it's in what we are calling our residential growth or medium residential growth area, they could put 4 lots on there because our minimum is 30,000, 4 structures on there. And it would have to make sure it still complied with our septic and wastewater and all that type of stuff.
Let me jump in real quick. So this is, don't have to subdivide the lot.
That's a good question.
Well, but see, that's the whole point. You're saying no, but I mean, this has been an issue in Jonesport a number of times, is that someone's got a bigger lot, they want to do something with it, and then because of unavailable road frontage and a whole bunch of other stuff, they're not allowed to subdivide the lot. But now you're saying, okay, but you can stick 4 houses on this thing. But that you can't have these 2 things that one saying one thing, the other saying another.
So I can answer that and hopefully not confuse you too much. LD 2003 is still subject to subdivision requirements. So If subdivision is triggered in any of the ways you can trigger a subdivision review, then that project will need to go through that. So in your case, that person may need to go through subdivision in order to add that third and fourth unit.
Okay.
Only if they're subdividing the land.
Correct.
If they're putting multiple structures on one piece of land, then you don't have to even think about subdivision.
And that was a change that occurred in 2019.
Yeah, you can put multiple.
No, we can't. The way our land use ordinance is written right now, we're obviously gonna have changed it.
Well, and I also think this is where and I know we're going off field here, but Betsy popped up something in chat that I think is pertinent as well. The state's definition of a subdivision is 3 dwelling units, 3 or more dwelling units. So if we do that, so a guy could do 3, so they can do 2, but once they hit 3 or 4, then subdivision laws.
That's subdividing the lot. That's not structures.
But what's the definition of a structure? And if you're putting dwelling units in there, then doesn't the definition of dwelling unit override the definition of structure?
Yeah, that's same.
So that's,
But I don't think 3 dwelling units kicks off a subdivision plot. But the only thing that kicks off subdivision, and Betsy can clarify this.
Yeah.
But I believe the only thing that kicks off the subdivision clause or requirement is 3 lots, subdividing your lot. You can put multiple dwellings on a single lot as long as your ordinance doesn't prohibit it.
Right, that's the clarity that I'm lost in, so.
That's not my understanding. You subdivide a building, it's a subdivision.
So state subdivision statutes were amended in 2019, 18. So I would just say we didn't talk about our background, but I was a planning director before taking this role. And I know that change caught the community I worked in off guard as well. So that's just a good plug to say, take a look at your ordinances if you haven't already. You may or may not be using something that is in compliance with what is in statute today as it relates to subdividing and structures.
Yeah, Betsy, clarify that. She's code enforcement officer for half the towns in Washington County.
Is she on?
Betsy?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Also, if you are a town that has zoning and uses ordinances, you certainly may already have something in your ordinances or could choose to add something that focused on how multiple principal buildings on a lot interact with each other. And that's not a requirement of LD 2003, but if you were taking your example of a large lot that could actually support 4 units, if you wanted to be allowing that to be facilitated easier, you could write something into your ordinance that crafted a way in which those structures could all be placed on the lot correctly. And it's easier to do that if there's access to public water and sewer, so you're not worried about how the distance from the wastewater capabilities are.
Okay. So that's the other biggie too, so.
Did we have any questions on Zoom before we move onward with our presentation?
That's great.
So I'll just mention that we're looking at, Betsy says her interpretation has been that dwelling units are separate. But we're looking at other possible options for workshop topics for the future. So if subdivision and land use ordinances rise up to the top, we can plug that in maybe for next time.
Hopefully this doesn't confuse you too much, but this next slide focuses on how LD 2003 interacts, this particular statute, which is 4364A, interacts with an existing single family home. So the previous slide was focused on what it would look like if there wasn't a residential use or if it was a vacant lot. If there's an existing single family home, statute and the rules that we had crafted after statute became law focused on allowing that single family, the lot with the single family home to be able to access that same up to 2-unit density provision. Meaning that if there's an existing single family home, you need to give that lot that has a single family home the ability to have an additional 2 units on them. And it's hard to see in the visual that you have on the screen or in front of you in person, but those yellow or orange structures are actually primary dwelling units. So those would be as if you were building a duplex or a second home or a triplex or a third home on the lot. But that additional unit can be either part of the structure as in a duplex or a triplex, or it could be a separate structure. The next provision that we'll talk about focuses on accessory dwelling units, and it's worth noting now and in the next section that for especially folks that utilize zoning and have a building permit process, but also folks that don't use zoning but have some sort of a building permit or building ordinance process. The LD 2003 requires that a municipality essentially stop a homeowner from double dipping. So if you are a single family, if you are a person that owns a single family home, you can choose either to add new units as it relates to the middle bucket, 4364A, or you can add accessory dwelling units under statute. Statute was trying to discourage folks from turning their house into a duplex and then also adding accessory dwelling units. When Hillary talks about ADUs, she'll talk about the fact that you can be more permissive. So if that is something you really want to encourage in your community, you can choose to do that. But generally, LD 2003 was assuming that a homeowner should only have the ability to add density through one of the 2 buckets and not through both. And we're going to move into ADU provisions, but assuming we still have time, we can go back to any of these sections and talk about anything, either high level stuff or in the weeds stuff when we get back to once we finish this presentation.
So the next statute that we're going to talk about is regarding accessory dwelling units, which we refer to as ADUs for short. So this section allows 1 ADU on a lot with an existing single family dwelling. Generally speaking, ADUs are units that are smaller than the primary structure, although they don't necessarily have to be, but they commonly might be used to house a family member, or you could be used as a rental, but they're generally smaller units that are placed on your property that is subordinate to the primary structure. So these units can be within the existing home, such as maybe an attic renovation or a basement renovation. It could be attached to it, so that can be through a shared wall or potentially a breezeway or some type of connecting structure. Or it could be a new structure, which is a freestanding unit in your backyard, for instance. The key to this statute is that an accessory dwelling unit, it is exempt from zoning density requirements. So before, how we were talking about minimum lot size, where you might say, for instance, that you can have 1 unit on 1 acre. And then for the previous statute, we said if you wanted to add another unit, you need 2 acres. In this situation, you cannot require additional lot area to accommodate the ADU.
And many
Getting some confused looks. So I just
it's a little scary. Some communities in the state, and I'm not positive if any of the communities that utilize zoning here in Washington County had utilized these terminologies before, but some communities in the state had already had something on the books related to accessory dwelling units and called them accessory apartments or mother-in-law apartments or something similar to that. But it's that type of a unit, which is the focus, that it is essentially subordinate to the primary structure or the larger home.
But I think that the difference here, and using the term accessory dwelling unit, is to acknowledge that it doesn't have to be a family member necessarily that lives in that unit. We know that some municipalities are placing additional requirements on who can live in that unit, but generally speaking, it can be rented out to anybody or used for your own personal use. It really, the possibilities are endless unless the community decides to regulate that further. Another key aspect to remember for accessory dwelling units is that a municipality cannot require additional parking spaces for the addition of the accessory dwelling unit. The only parking requirements that can be established are what is already established, which you may have already established for the single family home. ADUs, according to statute, must be a minimum of 190 square feet. The law does not establish a maximum. However, municipalities may establish a maximum size. Some communities have decided to say, okay, that means up to 800 square feet, for example, or they said 50% of the primary structure. That's how big this ADU can be. There are many different ways to do it. But you also don't have to set a maximum size, which could theoretically mean that the accessory dwelling unit is larger than the primary structure. This is a may provision, but municipalities may establish an application and permitting process for ADUs that does not require planning board approval. However, that's a may, so that can, if you already have an ADU provision and you require planning board approval, that can stay unless you want to do something different. Another provision is that an ADU is permitted on a lot, on a non-conforming lot, assuming that the addition of the structure does not further increase the nonconformity. So maybe a common example of that might be if you have an existing barn that can be converted into a accessory dwelling unit, but you're on a non-conforming lot, assuming that you could fit it within the confines of that barn, then you likely could build that ADU. I don't know if you have other good examples, but.
So if I can put that in language that I understand, or what, if I can just try to reiterate it. So you have a non-conforming lot, you can't expand the dimensions of an existing dwelling unit, but you can repurpose another structure that might be on that lot. Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct.
Does that make sense? Okay.
And if it is also a non-conforming structure, which it may be, then it would be subject to non-conformity if you are a town that uses zoning and defines that.
Okay, gotcha.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, but and this is all still subject to sewage and
Correct.
and all that type of stuff. So it could only be done if you get an HHE approval.
Yeah, so
Okay,
Betsy had put in the chat, concerning to LPIs is that ADUs add to capacity needs for the septic system. Most people do not understand the need for appropriate size considerations. Size of lot really has no bearing. So again, if you're adding an additional unit, that could put a burden on your current system, in which case you may need to make accommodations in your current system to accommodate the additional bedrooms for this unit.
okay.
And then I touched on this briefly, but municipalities may regulate short-term rentals such as Airbnb or VRBO in local ordinance. You know, for example, that Ellsworth did that. They added a provision in their ordinance that states that ADUs cannot be rented for what's
Less than 30 days.
less than 30 days, yeah. But that's a choice. Municipalities don't have to go there unless they want to. Is there any other questions?
Are there other questions related to ADUs specifically?
I'd like to clarify one thing. Bill was right. I was completely wrong. It is
Okay,
subdividing land, but also I'm looking at the state statute here. But if you take an original undeveloped parcel and turn it into a 3-unit apartment, that's considered a subdivision. So it's dwelling units and
Yeah.
subdividing land. It's both.
okay,
And
got it.
I thought it was just land. What?
Yeah.
I said, I'm not involved in this for you.
Yeah, no, you guys are right. I was completely
Yeah.
wrong.
Yeah,
So that does come into play. So my understanding is that the rule that says that the subdivision clause comes into effect if you take an undeveloped lot or existing house or whatever and turn it into 3 units, which according to this would turn it into a subdivision. This then overrides that.
So it's actually up on the screen, although we were going to pause for a second, but Subdivision rules would still be something that would be applicable for a project that includes adding new primary dwelling units. So if you were taking a structure and turning it into a triplex or a quadplex, or doing other things that trigger subdivision with 3 or 4 units, then subdivision would still apply.
Okay.
An ADU, unless a town was more permissive, would never have the numbers to support subdivision, but it's moot because theoretically the accessory dwelling unit is accessory to the principal dwelling, meaning that it can't really exist without a primary structure that is.
That was gonna be my question. I thought,
Yeah.
how can you have the subdivision if you don't have it subdivided from any?
Well, you don't have to subdivide it from anything. Anytime you create more than 3 living units, you've created a subdivision, whether it's even in one building,
What?
even if it's in one building.
Well, that's what I thought. So
It is.
I said a
That's what
while ago, but I,
That's,
No, you're right.
that's what subdivision law is.
Before we move past accessory dwelling units, are there any questions on Zoom or ADU provisions?
Because if you subdivide.
so I think the question you're asking, is this 2003 going to override the subdivision to?
No, subdivision law would still apply to those specific scenarios that we.
Some of these things you're saying here, that you can't put these extra units on a existing lot.
But subdivision law would
Why
be
doesn't
triggered
that
and
say
then you
the
would have to
subdivision
go
law?
through a municipality subdivision requirements.
This is discussion about subdivision and she's talking about.
Anyway.
Yeah,
So it's sort of hard to talk in generalizations, but generally
Yeah.
speaking, subdivision law potentially triggered adding additional units. 2003. Because
Yeah. So it is really confusing and I've even I've been to one of your sessions and I've read through and I'm still so I apologize, but so there is a distinction between how many dwelling units, you know, and that type of stuff. When it comes to an accessory dwelling unit, is that limited to just one? Or is there multiple dwelling units that can be put on a?
So the minimum requirements of LD 2003 is if you have one existing single family home, you are allowed to add 1 accessory dwelling unit unless you are more permissive in local ordinance.
And we've heard of communities that have determined that they would like duplexes to be able to have accessory dwelling units as well. So they've said a single family home can have a duplex, have a accessory dwelling unit, but also a duplex can have an accessory dwelling unit. But that is not required by statute. Statute is just 1 single family home and 1 accessory dwelling unit.
Okay.
So this slide that's up on the screen right now is just some other general things to keep in mind that may restrict development that we just talked about. So the first would be valid and enforceable easements, covenant, deed restrictions, and other private agreements between parties could still restrict development. So for instance, if there's a deed restriction that says you can only have a single family home on a lot in a subdivision, then that would apply and then somebody couldn't add an additional unit or an additional accessory dwelling unit. For
Okay.
instance, that's just one example. Looking at me. You have a question?
No. I'm just wondering how you're gonna make this all work, because there are several things that are now conflicting with existing law.
Yes.
And you said when we started today, that these units can be put in.
I
And
think
now we run into all kinds of issues where,
the best way to think about LD 2003 is that you're allowing the uses to occur in ordinance, but on individual lots, that may not be the case. There's an individual analysis on lots based on the lot size, based on the water and wastewater capacity of the lot, based on if there are any deed restrictions on the lot. But really, municipalities just need to allow these uses to occur in ordinance. But then it'll be a different analysis when the code enforcement officer is actually working with an individual lot owner.
this is a difficult enough process as it is, and it's just been complicated by a factor of 10.
Mhm.
Anyway, but go ahead, we're gonna run out of time, so keep going.
But I do think that LD 2003, while it does allow additional uses on on lots, it doesn't necessarily remove any of the protections in place that a code enforcement officer was doing when they were allowing any other type of development to occur. I mean, there still has to be water and wastewater. They still need to check setbacks and frontage. So I understand that it's overwhelming when you're adding new use types, but the procedure you have in place to make sure that buildings were habitable still applies. It just feels a little different because you're allowing uses that you've never allowed before.
I think it's wonderful in the best possible world, but we don't necessarily live in the best possible world. There are predators out there who will do anything they want to do if they can get away with it.
Well, I think that's where municipalities do have a little bit of wiggle room where they can establish short-term rental ordinances. I didn't mention this with accessory dwelling units, but some municipalities have said that have established owner occupancy requirements where an owner needs to live either in the accessory dwelling unit or the primary structure.
That's
And,
That's
you know, there are certain restrictions that some municipalities are putting in place so that there's not uncontrollable development.
Yeah.
Or minimum lot size requirements, for instance.
Yes, yes, that's all good. We like it.
And just the last two quickly.
I was gonna say Joanne has a message and a question in the chat as well.
Yeah. If builder states they are going with composting toilets and not subject to septic regs, how does that affect other dwellings or ADU numbers on lots? Okay.
I feel badly giving an answer that's sort of a non-answer, but for any of the new development that's occurring for provision through LD 2003, the code officer or the LPI would need to ensure that there's adequate water and wastewater. So it would be up to that individual to determine if the composting toilets can meet those requirements or not. And I know that's a horrible non-answer, but I think the point of this is still to give you as a municipality, as the review body, if you will, the ability to determine is there the ability to serve for adequate water and wastewater. And those provisions that exist in either in other state codes, including Title 12, Chapter 423A, and other provisions are still something that are applicable.
Are all the code enforcers trained? Are they up to speed on this?
I think it varies. I know there's a couple of code enforcement officers in the room, so feel free to jump in, but I think that folks are getting more knowledgeable. We actually hope to at some point in 2024, although it may be post the date that we'll talk about on the next in a slide or two. But post implementation date, we would hope to do some sort of a training or to have more information go out to code enforcement officers.
The answer is no. Because I am code enforcement officer.
But you're here today learning about it right now, so that's good.
Well, I've learned about it because it's the same as Harry. I'm on the LPC for Maine Municipal.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the state providing training for us, they have not.
Yes, I know. We're working on it. We're working on it.
They haven't done that for probably 5-6 years now.
Yeah. We're really focusing on making sure municipalities are up to speed and have their ordinances done, but we do recognize that the next level is supporting code enforcement officers because they are bearing the bulk of the duty here.
That would be most helpful for communities, really.
And I can see we have a hand raised on Zoom. I'm sorry, I'm gonna mispronounce your first name, but Terry Silver.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that composting toilet subject. The way in the state of Maine, you're allowed to have a primitive system is if you hand pump or hand haul your water and it's under 25 gallons per day. That's the way you can have a primitive composting system. And so therefore I see that one could still have an ADU on a lot if there is less than 25 gallons of water used and they're either hand pumped or hand hauled.
Thank you for that clarification. That is, I am a planner by trade and not a code enforcement officer, so that is way out of my wheelhouse.
Okay. In the interest of time, I know we have you have a 4 o'clock meeting scheduled. Just briefly, just wanted to acknowledge that this law was amended this past summer. So LD 2003 was amended by LD 1706. And we've touched on a lot of the changes that were in LD 1706 already, talking about non-conforming lots and shoreland zoning. But I think the most important one to note is that for municipalities that use town meeting to adopt ordinances, the implementation date for LD 2003 is July 1st, 2024. So I don't think that there are any communities either on Zoom or here that utilize town or city council to adopt ordinances. Am I correct?
No.
You have a.
We have a town meeting, which.
So, yep.
Or if something comes up, then we have special.
Do it in
town meeting
January.
call
Yep.
to vote on it.
Yep.
Because the town has to vote
No,
on
I'm
it.
just saying.
Yeah, so your
They
adoption.
don't have a council or anything that decides.
I think there may be 1 or 2 communities in Washington County that do have a actual town council that determine
board.
ordinances.
Each board.
Thank you. I was like, I'm blanking on which one it is, but the majority of folks here around this table and on Zoom would have a July 1st implementation date, which would be hopefully enough time to be able to have either ordinances be voted on in your regular town meeting or to set a general
Did you say 24?
2024, yes.
I know we're
So this,
behind.
When are we gonna get this done? She's on the-
By July 1st, 2024.
we should note that most communities are trying to get this done for their set annual town meeting. However, we'll talk about this in a second, but we do have some funding where if you had to establish a special town meeting in order to comply with LD 2003, we potentially could have funding to support that if you weren't able to meet your deadlines for
Yeah.
your current, this year's town meeting.
It's gonna take me by 3 or 4 more iterations, but I'm getting more and more comfortable because honestly, we don't have anything that is restricting people from developing
Right.
lots.
Yeah.
The ADUs concern me just a wee bit, and we'll have to really focus, I think we would focus on that first, especially with the no restriction in the shoreland ordinance. That runs counter to everything we've been trying to do, but I think between the fact that it's gotta have an HHE, and if the subdivision law works up because somebody wants to put 4 out, and we still have road requirements and that type of stuff.
The rate the wheel turns to getting these things done. I don't think how we're gonna get them done by July.
So I think that you bring up a good point in the sense that some municipalities may only have a very short building permit ordinance, for instance, where they technically already allow this type of development to occur because there's no prohibition in any land use documents. So for those municipalities, they might not necessarily have to do anything to comply with the law. However, per your point, if there's something that's of particular concern, you may want to flesh it out more in land use ordinance. For instance, an ADU section where you establish some parameters. So that's the challenging part about LD 2003 is that there's there isn't language that fits nicely into every community's land use ordinances and zoning ordinances.
Right, and for the 2/3 or so of the communities in Washington County that do not utilize zoning districts or zoning. As Hillary mentioned, you may have minimal, if any, changes you need to do. You need to ensure that someone has access to create an ADU on a single family home. You do ensure that someone could build up to 2 units or maybe 4 units, depending on how those are triggered on individual lots. But if you do not have zoning, there may be less you need to do than a community that does have a zoning code. But our up on the screen, it kind of just reiterates which one of those buckets are applicable for which communities. And for the ADU provision and the up to 4 dwelling unit provision, it's all communities in the state have to ensure that they are giving that access to a lot owner to be able to have that additional density. But you may need to do minimal or nothing if you do not have zoning and don't use a building ordinance or building permit process.
Before we run out of time, we did want to mention that we do have funding to support municipalities with LD 2003 compliance work. So municipalities with and without zoning are eligible to request funding from our office, the Housing Opportunity Program, to support any of the things that you may need to do to comply with this law. So that could be if you hire an attorney to review your ordinances, if you incur costs related to having a town meeting and the public notices, any consultant fees that you incur to update ordinances, any staff or volunteer time that is put towards LD 2003 compliant. Generally speaking, we have up to $10,000 per community. However, the up to 10,000 is really municipalities that have designated growth areas or public water and sewer. Municipalities that don't have designated growth areas or public water sewer are eligible for up to $5,000. And for communities that have zoning, we just ask you to send us documentation, the documents that you use, land use documents such as a comprehensive plan or any land use ordinances, so we have a better understanding of what you are doing to comply with LD 2003 if you need to do anything at all.
Yeah, that was the one thing I noticed on the stuff that you sent us. I hope you're going to send that kind of same batch of stuff, but it sounded like you need to send a comprehensive plan, a land use ordinance, your zoning maps, and then a federal decennial census.
Not everyone, that doesn't apply to everyone, but
Okay.
have that designation.
Okay, so if you don't have that, you can still apply and you'll figure it out.
Yes, the only reason why we're asking for more information from communities that don't have zoning is that it's not always easy to tell on the surface what you may need to do, because you, for instance, you mentioned you don't expressly
Gotcha.
prohibit anything in ordinance, so maybe you don't need to do anything. But if you want to add an ADU section, we are more than happy to support you.
Facilitate. I got you. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, we're not trying to single out communities that don't have.
But to just clarify, so if we don't have zoning, if we don't have anything in our ordinance that restricts the property to a single unit, and we don't, then we don't really need to do anything, and we don't want the $5,000, then we don't need to do anything.
Likely, yes, but we have been encouraging municipalities to still have someone, possibly an attorney, review it just to make sure that you don't have to do anything. And we can help cover the cost of, that $500 if it takes them 2 hours to review or whatever. We just don't want you to miss something and then be subject to an angry town resident.
You can also come to the conclusion that just because you aren't required to do anything, that isn't the best answer, and that the best answer is that you may want to do something, whether it's add a section on accessory dwelling units as it relates to short-term rentals, or add a new permitting process because you're realizing that there are differences between an accessory dwelling unit and a primary dwelling unit, and you want to make sure that your code officer can catch that and catalog that. You may need to do nothing, but there may be choices, policy choices to do more than nothing if you so choose to do that.
This may sound like a hopelessly frivolous question, but is there anything that would behoove us to look at design possibilities of these houses, these subdivisions or ADUs? Because this landscape out here is getting peppered with these lovely little Amish boxes. And every time somebody builds something, a lot of Amish boxes. And I'm thinking, this is going to end up like a lot of ticky-tacky.
I have two thoughts about that. The first is that some municipalities have put in ordinance some design or aesthetic provisions, especially in like village districts or historic districts where there might be certain colors and styles. And if that's important to the community, you put it in there.
Yeah.
Also, there is some push at the state level and at the legislature to support people with financing accessory dwelling units, as well as supporting municipalities with creating ADU designs. It's nothing that has funding yet, but I just wanted to throw it out there because I think there's maybe some momentum for some communities adopting set designs that people can utilize.
Yeah, I threw out to the select board the other night. I said, you know, it's a bit of a stretch, but have we ever considered going to an architectural university and saying, get your students together, present this as a contest, come up with some low-income housing, who can do the best job? And it might start, it might work.
Yeah, I think there is some momentum among communities to think about design and having that be options for people as they're thinking about building these units, but I don't think there's quite the funding for a large scale thing, but I think that's
I'm just trying to avoid the monopoly board.
And generally, it's a little bit trickier until you do or possibly do adopt a zoning ordinance.
Yeah.
If you only utilize a building ordinance, you would want to run past good legal counsel the best way to craft those particular ordinances, because it may be easier in a particular zoning code than it would be with just a building permit process.
I would think that there must be some creative ways of going on.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's momentum there.
Yeah.
For sure. And I wanted to ask you, it's past 4. Should we wrap it up or?
So I would leave that question up to Betsy Fitzgerald and Lois Pinkham. They're the chair and vice chair of the Council of Governments.
Betsy.
Okay,
All
Lois,
right.
you're in the room. Do you want to start right now or do you want to give them a few more minutes for questions?
I always see about 5 of us present.
I would agree.
Well, you think about 3?
I think she's right.
I'm fine going a few more.
And I just want to throw something in very quickly. One, all towns, if you need census information, go to sunrisecounty.org, click on community development, and underneath community profiles. Every town in Washington County is up there with complete census information, as well as a desktop view with just some data that is often useful, especially for comprehensive planning. But just a quick question, are there any ordinance templates around that could be used by towns related to LD 2003?
Karen Weston might know that.
So some regional planning organizations are providing model ordinances to their communities that they serve. We haven't seen them yet. However, we are happy to send around some ordinances that we know of that have been updated, if that would be useful to the communities you serve.
If you
But
would,
generally,
yeah,
yeah, we can do that.
thank you.
Yeah, generally, when Hillary and I were looking at trying to craft, especially the rules around how LD 2003 would be implemented locally, we determined it is really tricky to take what's in statute and turn it into a one-size-fits-all component. Actually, the statute was purposefully kept from one-size-fits-all, which I think is great for our home rule capabilities. There's things for a lot of the communities here in the room that you may want to keep or not legislate that someone in Southern Maine may want to legislate or have some other provision in. So it really was trying to retain your ability to have local control over a lot of these decisions. And so, especially with many of you not having actual zoning ordinances anyway, or maybe a hybrid of shoreline zoning and some other stuff, it gets complicated if you were to try to be taking what Portland or Bangor is doing and putting it in a community here.
No, I didn't know if there might be just a model ordinance for towns that don't have zoning, or, have only the mandated shoreline zoning kind of thing. That's all.
I actually think if you could provide the language that would be required to update your ordinance as far as the ADUs would probably be most important for most of them.
I think you're right in the sense that a model ordinance could be useful for accessory dwelling units because there might be an easy way to just sort of slide that in. But I think that the middle bucket that we talked about, the up to 4 dwelling unit, that's where it gets tricky. But we're happy to provide some examples of an ADU ordinance that other communities have already passed.
I think that would be very helpful for folks.
We'll send out an email to Jen tomorrow.
Are you accessible? I mean, if we run into a
Yep.
giant wall,
So large walls or
So-
just small hurdles. You can, our contact information is on the screen, or those of you here in the office have it on the printout. You can email us at that housing.vc@maine.gov email. Hillary and I both check that mailbox. So depending on the hour in the day, you may get a response back from one of the two of us. But we check that frequently. Also up on the page is our web address, which has a plethora of information related to LD 2003, including information on the payment program that Hillary mentioned, and how to access that funding. Our rules related to kind of the nuts and bolts of how it all works. And then some information for some resource guides and handouts that we have that we didn't bring for you today, but are accessible on our website.
Okay, okay.
And I feel like there were folks on Zoom that may not have had a chance to ask any questions. So was there anybody on Zoom that had a question that you'd like to ask of us of any of the topics of LD 2003?
Any other questions in the room before we?
Well, I was
head
gonna
out?
say, I'm the only one on Zoom who's been I'm the main voice on Zoom that's been piping up, but one of the questions I had the other day was related to shoreline zoning. Someone was under the impression that accessory dwelling units and the additional units could go into the shoreline zone regardless.
No,
That shoreline zoning was not counted. So
absolutely not.
well, that's what I was gonna say. From what I saw in the guidance, it said that shoreline zoning still takes if a town has shoreline zoning, it still takes precedence.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bullet is it? The first one. So generally speaking, municipalities cannot expressly prohibit accessory dwelling units in the shoreline zone, but shoreline zoning regulations could limit an ADU actually being on a lot. So as long as there's not an express prohibition in shoreline zoning that you can't have ADUs, that's really what we're trying to stop.
I guess that's okay as long as it doesn't kind of lead somebody to think that it's okay that they can do it. And then when the code officer or the planning board says, no, you can't, they get all cranky because now they can't do it. So what you're saying is go right ahead and do it if you can meet the rules, and you can't meet the rules, so you can't do it. Do I have that right?
Yeah. Shoreline
Great,
zoning,
thank you.
yes.
Let's call a spade, folks.
Yeah, that was a little confusing for us too, so.
And what the intent, that actually came out of LD 1706 that was passed in the legislative session in spring of 23. And that intent was because there had been some challenges with clarity between the interplay between LD 2003 and shoreline zoning, the legislature added that kind of second amendment to just make sure that communities were aware that you need to still give someone the access to build the ADU, but that ADU, just like building a regular residential unit, is still subject to things in shoreline zoning. So they still need to have the correct frontage requirements and land area requirements. And it may or may not be able to go into a structure that is closer than it should be to the body of water, which I think is the biggest concern was a structure that was built 100 or 110 years ago that is no longer allowed to be built there and is non-conforming, and whether that could be an ADU. And the same shoreline zoning requirements for the single family homes still apply for the accessory dwelling unit.
we have some guys that want a piece of land in Quebec right along the shore. And they want to put a dock way out into the water.
Don't
And even though we say no, they continue to stay there and we say no again. And I think they're waiting for us all to die. And at the dead of night, they'll sneak in there and build it. That's what I meant by predatory builders. You know?
I give props to the code enforcement officers in the room or the code enforcement officers on the call. You guys have a lot on your plate. I don't know how you do it day in and day out. I'm always amazed. I've primarily worked in lower mid coast and I live in lower mid coast, but there is a gentleman who has a houseboat who conveniently always moves the boat between the town lines of 3 communities on the Androscoggin River, and whichever code enforcement officer is bugging him that day, he'll just move the boat and into.
That's
So
right.
I think it's a problem everywhere. That's fine.
So, okay.
Okay.
I think I
So
feel.
I
mean,
would like
feel-
to thank,
They're kind of, so.
I was gonna say Hillary and Ben, thank you very much for coming in person and presenting today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you.
If there are more questions, please reach out to us. Our contact information is on the screen, or you have it if you were here with us. Send us an email. You can, our phone number isn't up there, but you can find our phone numbers on the website as well. We're happy to do individual conversations via email or Zoom with you or your communities. We do information sessions with planning board as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And for anyone who wasn't on the Zoom earlier when I mentioned it, if you please put your email address in the chat, I will make sure that you get the materials from this